Welcome to the Geoeconomics Podcast. I am your host, Niza Gonzalez, and today I'm speaking with Jeffrey Mason from the Charter Cities Institute. Today we're here to talk about the important role data has in the development of cities and the new cities map launch. But before we talk about the launch, let's start with the introduction of who you are, Jeffrey, and what is CCI and what does the organization do?
Hi, Nisa. Thanks for having me on the podcast. I'm Jeffrey Mason. I'm the research manager at the Charter Cities Institute, or CCI. CCI is a nonprofit organization whose mission is to empower new cities with better governance to lift tens of millions of people out of poverty. And we're dedicated to building the ecosystem for charter cities. New cities granted a special jurisdiction to create new governance systems.
Great. Well, it's good to have you, Jeffrey, on this podcast. So the first thing I like to start this podcast with is knowing more about what are the new cities, especially those that have a master plan.
Humans building new cities is obviously a very, very old phenomenon, but we're seeing a deliberate trend in the past several decades, dedicated efforts at creating purposely built master planned cities from the ground up, rather than sort of the emergent type of cities that, there was no central planner, central person who decided, we're going to build a city here and it's going to follow this pattern or this grid or anything like that. But something we're seeing increasingly throughout the world are deliberate city projects where there is a single development plan and the city is built to that plan and can still grow and expand over time, but has that sort of central coordinating mechanism as opposed to a more organic or emergent city.
So as you mentioned, then these new cities that have a master plan tend to have kind of like a plan of how they're going to be growing and developing, other than the organic cities that just grow without any type of plan. So if we were to examine what would be the challenge and benefits by building a city with a master plan, what would you consider those would be?
So some of the, I think, advantages to building new cities with a master plan. Well, one, I think it's actually important to sort of set some context in which new cities are being built today. Throughout much of the global South, especially sub-Saharan Africa, South and East Asia and elsewhere, we're seeing really, really rapid urbanization. And, the world's leading cities in terms of population are increasingly concentrated in these regions of the world. And part of the both government and I think private sector response to such high levels of urbanization in a lot of these places is not just to expand existing cities and densify existing cities, but to also build new cities. And especially in places where maybe financial resources are a bit limited, or technical capacity is limited, or the economies maybe aren't really capable of fully providing the opportunities that new urban dwellers might like. In some of these contexts, government and private developers are turning to building new cities, satellite cities, greenfield cities, and in addition to the cities that already exist. And one of the advantages of doing this is that you can sort of from the ground up correct a lot of the mistakes and sort of legacy institutions and heritage that some of the existing cities have sort of come and have baked in that maybe aren't conducive to what they really need now. So in things like regarding infrastructure upgrading, it's a lot more costly to upgrade existing infrastructure in an already built up area than it is to lay down new infrastructure, 2, 3, 4 times as costly to do that. In a lot of cases, especially in these regions I mentioned before, a lot of these cities are laid out as sort of, and they have these legacies of being sort of colonial outposts, and that isn't necessarily conducive to cities that function well for their residents, that make sense from a sort of spatial planning perspective, that are conducive to economic growth. So these are some of the types of issues that building new master plan cities can address. At the same time, there are also challenges associated with building new cities. So some of the things we've seen, Brasilia is often a common example of this. It's built to this very interesting master plan, and it looks like a bird or an airplane when viewed from above, and that's very interesting. But once the city sort of grew beyond what the capacity of that initial master plan intended, the elegance of it sort of falls apart, and the city doesn't quite work as well for those who have to sort of live on the periphery of that city, rather than those who are sort of maybe in that initial core. So that's one of the challenges for these types of projects going forward is striking a balance between the need to plan out, major roads, infrastructure, rights of way, delineating, public and private land and plots, and allowing for organic expansion, in accordance with reasonable planning, but also to avoid the sort of over planning and the sort of rigid and unflinching adherence to a master plan, which can stifle the emergence of a new and effective and productive city.
Right. I think one of the things that you mentioned that maybe you can go a little bit in depth with is these new emerging cities on the global south. You mentioned there's a lot of cities being created, whether it is redevelopment or greenfield or satellite cities. But in general, why do you think the global south has had such a big trend of creating new cities? What would be like the motivation?
I think there's probably a couple pieces to that. One, like I talked about before, is that the challenges in existing cities, and in some cases we're talking about cities like Lagos or Kinshasa that are really developing into truly mega cities that will overtake the if current trends continue will overtake world's currently largest cities, many of which are in East Asia, but they really don't have the capacity to keep up in terms of infrastructure, services, jobs with the urbanization rates as they are. So there's a potential advantage. Of course, it's important to still invest and solve those problems in those cities, but there's also an opportunity to help capture some of that urbanization in new cities that can help ameliorate some of those issues before they crop up. And then the other thing I think is that you see there's lots of different types of new cities focusing on different segments of the market, different industries. And so, what the inspiration is across the global south really varies. For example, a project we've worked with quite a bit called Etana or Talent City in Nigeria outside of Lagos is intended to be a new tech hub. Right, Nigeria is well regarded as a hub for tech talent, but Lagos isn't a great place to support tech talent. It's not going to attract tech talent there. And so the founder of Etana, Ayin Abayeji, he thought, well, we want to keep this talent here. We want to build up this ecosystem, this tech ecosystem here. How can we do that? And so he's building out a new town to do just that. And from projects like that to all the way on kind of the other end of the spectrum, large scale, it's still mixed use, but industrial focused cities or new capital cities. There's all kinds of different motivations across the global south for building these new cities, and that's manifesting. Those desires are manifesting themselves in lots of different and interesting new city developments.
Definitely. I think that within the global south, especially in Africa so far, I saw a big trend of new cities created. And as you mentioned, it could be even from a satellite city to having a tech hub, even going into resorts. There's various ways why a city could be created. Even, for example, Egypt with they're starting, it has happened for a while, but they started like a new administrative cities near the Nile, in which basically they just wanted to populate that area. So yeah, definitely there's various motivations about the creation of new cities. And so you also mentioned from Brasilia and the case where in any case they weren't able to plan outside of the structure that they had for the plant population, right? So they weren't able to address the long-term sustainability of their population. But do you have any examples of successful master plan cities that have achieved their ambition purpose and actually made an impact for their communities?
Sure. So a lot of the new cities that have been successful have been built up as new capitals or other types of government districts, and they tend to be successful, in part because it's the government, and they can say, okay, if you work, in such and such ministry, right, you have to be located there, so you get a natural sort of population. Washington D.C., where I am, of course, is one such city. More recently, Nigeria, the capital of Nigeria, Abuja, is another sort of one of these relatively successful new capital cities. But there's also other types of cities that have been particularly successful. And there's one in particular that I think listeners might find interesting that we've written a little bit about that's located in China. And some of our colleagues and friends at the MIT Sustainable Urbanization Lab have done some really interesting research about is that of Guan in China. It's kind of located between Beijing and Tianjin. And what makes this sort of new city interesting is rather than being sort of built up as a new sort of government center or something like that, it's an interesting case of a sort of successful private city in the sense that sort of the county government there basically allowed a private developer to come in, develop this large area, attract residents and industries, share tax revenues on all of this kind of thing, all these sorts of activities. And so I think that sort of shows there's kind of a wide variety of types of successful new cities, both from government initiatives, but also new cities that have been led successfully from the private side.
I think during this for this ecosystem of new cities, there's a lot of examples in which you can say, okay, there are certain things that could have been done better, and there's cities which you've showed some examples that have done a great while achieving their purposes. So with that, I would also like to get into how much data available there is in the ecosystem of new cities, right? So to what extent do you think there's a lack of data in the industry, and how does that impact the development of new cities?
Yeah, that's a great question. And a lot of the research and the sort of broader new cities community, a lot of what exists out there, it's not really systematic in any sort of way. It's very sort of case study, individualized type of research that's also generally sort of qualitative in nature as opposed to quantitative. And all that's great, but it makes it difficult to study new cities as any sort of comprehensive subject. And so that's one of the gaps. That's really the big gap that I think we're trying to fill with this new cities map and its accompanying database. Is to bring some data to bear and some more rigor to research and scholarship on new cities. And there are some existing similar databases and interactive map products out there, but none of those document detail on governance of cities and all kinds of information about the history of the city to the depth that this new map that we're launching with you folks at the Adrianople Group. None of those other maps even come close to the level of detail that we're making available for the first time on modern new cities.
Right. So basically, the ecosystem hasn't been studied as a whole. And so, if more information were to be available, to understand it as a whole, what kind of information do you think would be necessary?
So I think to introduce sort of more systematic and more potentially rigorous research, we need to know more about what actually goes into running these cities. How much, what did it actually cost to build them? How much does it cost to operate them? What, if anything, do these cities have regulatory or policymaking or fiscal or other types of authority over? And you can start to categorize and really develop a much more comprehensive view of what new cities are and all the different sort of subtypes and develop a much richer picture of the space. And that's beneficial not just research for its own sake, but research that can actually go and benefit policymakers, especially in countries that are building lots of new cities or that there is interest in doing so. And this research can also inform city developers themselves. They can look and see, okay, here are the projects that are along whatever dimensions are similar to what we have in mind. Here's information about them. Here's how much it cost when they built it. What powers and authorities did they get, which influences the outcomes that we see today, and can really help give developers and governments a much clearer picture of what successful and unsuccessful new cities have done in the past, and what works, what doesn't, and how to make their projects more effective and better targeted for their prospective residents and investors.
So we now know that data itself is very important to compare a little bit with other cities and be able to make decisions for new development. So do you have any examples of cities that have been able to be transparent with their development and that could also help other cities to develop, as an example?
There are some new cities, that have been studied in a fair amount of depth. Like I said, that city in China I mentioned before, Wuhan. There's an excellent chapter in a book called Towards Urban Economic Vibrancy that goes into all of the kind of nitty gritty details on this. But there's a lot of other interesting things that have been written out there about some of the more well known new cities that exist in the world. There's over 300. cataloged in our map alone, which is filtered down from based on some inclusion criteria from a initial master list of over 1,000. So there's lots of cities in there, and the data that we were able to provide just from what's publicly available is actually pretty comprehensive in terms of, like I said, operating budgets, everything about location, administrative entities, et cetera. There's actually a lot that's out there that we were able to provide.
So if a policymaker were to start a development and that they had this information available, right, what would be certain topics that they could prioritize for the creation of new cities?
Yeah, so I think some of the important things to look at might be location. You can see, okay, is the city near, or does it have its own airport, seaport? Is it located, near sort of other major cities? Right, because that obviously has an impact on sort of the local economy and on population movement and all those kind of things. But I think it's also important, really important from a policymaker's perspective, to look at what these cities, from a governance perspective, what they actually have authority over. This is a problem you see throughout a lot of the global South, where there are things that we sort of obviously understand them to be cities, but they don't necessarily operate as you might think of the way city governments operate in say the United States, where there's a clear municipal authority, and in a lot of these countries, power tends to be very centralized. And so maybe there's a city government, but it's maybe very weak and sort of relies on lots of transfers from the central government, or maybe the government is really fragmented, right? We think of Lagos as one city, and if I remember correctly, it's sort of actually, when you take the area that is commonly considered Lagos, there's like well over like a dozen actual different like municipal governments sort of within that scope, and you see that again and again and again in Africa, or in some cases there really is no sort of municipal government below the concept just sort of doesn't exist below in law below the sort of county level like it does in Kenya, for example. So I think the building new cities, especially with many of them endowed with some kind of special economic zone status or special jurisdiction status, policymakers can look at this data and they can see, okay, here's what other cities, new cities, master plan cities worldwide have and have not had authority over, and they can think about how that might influence the outcomes, how it influenced the outcomes of that city, and how whether or not that city can govern a particular segment of its affairs, how that fits into their sort of political and economic situation, and how that could or could not help a particular new city thrive in their country.
So every city then has a different way of managing, whether that is having more responsibility over service or more decision making on the things that will be benefiting the city. So is there any example of any city which they have done policies differently that have just been beneficial for their communities?
So lots of these new cities are being organized as sort of special economic zones, or some other similar type of jurisdiction. So one example that comes to mind, like I actually just mentioned it in Kenya, which is sort of one of these emerging hubs for new cities in Africa. There's an interesting project there, sort of south of Nairobi, called Kanza Technopolis, and it's sort of being built as a sort of technology hub for Kenya, but there's also sort of other sort of industrial and residential components as well, and it's operating under sort of Kenya's special economic zone regime. And it seems to be, this development seems to be sort of moving along quite nicely, and I think will sort of help Kenya continue to be sort of a player in that ecosystem. So that's just one example. When you're building something from the ground, a city from the ground up, it's a much easier prospect to say, okay, this new thing that we're building, it's going to play under a set of special rules or some sort of special jurisdiction status, than to say, okay, here's an existing city of 100,000 people. This is now a special economic zone under these sort of very different rules. It's a much easier sell, I think, from a political perspective for these types of projects, because they're being organized from the ground up to play under a special set of rules or different economic regulation.
So as every city has a different set of policies that may be using, or even better, similar, because within a country they could use similar policies. But how can we promote the research of other cities from other parts of the world to be seen, to be studied, and to be taken into consideration when policymakers are trying to decide on, social, economic, or environmental challenges.
So there's a lot of this research out there already, and I think it's really just a matter of sort of translating it into sort of formats that the policymakers will find receptive, and sort of making clear what the applications are of experiences in other places to wherever they happen to be. Right? I think it's easy to say, oh well, they did this in China, so you in Nigeria should do this, or a version of that, right? That there's kind of a translation that has to go on in terms of, okay, great, there are the lessons to be learned from what cities over here did. Here's the context, economic, political, social, whatever context um, that was done, and think carefully about sort of the mapping to wherever it is that you're trying to apply those lessons. And this is one of the things where sometimes a best practices approach, depending on what it is you're doing, sometimes that works perfectly fine. You can pretty much can control C, control V, and it works great. But there's lots of other settings where that's not the case. People try to efforts policy from a policy perspective, people try to pursue that type of approach, and it just kind of falls flat because the contexts are very different, the economic situations are very different, and it just doesn't work like that. So I think there's tons of examples to learn from. Like, lots of people have been doing research on this space. CCI is trying to contribute to the research in this space, and we hope the map will not only contribute to sort of creating more research and higher quality research, but we'll also start to see more of the social sciences delve into research on new cities. So far, not exclusively, but a lot of the research on new cities has kind of been the domain of urban studies and urban planning, geography, and similar academic fields. But I think there's value to be had in bringing the study of new cities, and helping provide the tools to bring the study of new cities to economics, political science, and other fields in social science as well, to expand that roster of research and policy advice that's available.
So we've mentioned various times already the new cities map and how it can be helpful for policymakers or any researcher that's just trying to see more about the ecosystem that the new cities have, and to have context, as you mentioned, about their economic or governance situations for comparison or just understanding them. We're getting more in depth with the research. So I want to get more in depth now with this map. So what is the new cities map?
So in short, the New Cities Map is a project to identify, catalog, and map every modern new city in the world. As I mentioned before, over 1,000 new cities were considered in just shy of 2 years of research that went into this map. And the map that we'll be launching and sharing and the accompanying fully accessible database has over 300 new cities in it. And so I think I should talk briefly about what the inclusion criteria for the cities on this map are, and how that sort of shapes what the objectives of the new cities map are. So one is time frame. You can find, depending on what you call a new city, right? You can go back forever and identify new cities, but we specifically wanted to track efforts in the modern era. So we're tracking post 1945 new cities. Second, we're tracking cities that are explicitly envisioned as cities. The marketing resources, the promotional material, available information that's out there, public information that's out there about it, it is actually considered a city. It's not just an industrial park or some other type of development, that maybe might have some residential or some other types of land use or something like that in it, but it's not really organized or conceived of in any way as a city proper. The third inclusion criteria is population. We wanted to target things that really are cities, and so for that reason, we're looking at cities where the current population is at least 100,000, or the project has an explicitly stated goal to have at least 100,000 residents. And this cutoff helps keep the sort of database manageable. A lower threshold would obviously introduce so many more towns to start to dilute what we feel is the purpose of this map is to catalog these sort of large scale new city projects. So at least 100,000 people. The next criteria, which I think is an interesting one, is that it either has to have already or is planned to have a school, which we're using as sort of a proxy measure for whether or not the city is mixed use in nature. if you have a city where it's just workers, there's no people commuting in and out or something, or worker dorm, something like that, right? It's not really a city in a meaningful sense. But if you've got children there and there's a school, there's presumably going to be all the other types of amenities that a real city has. And so we feel that this is an effective proxy for capturing that a city is actually sort of mixed use in nature and like truly is a city. The next criteria is that it is master planned and that there is some kind of central coordinating entity that's making decisions about sort of the build out of the city and other types of planning decisions, right? There are sort of famous cases of cities out there that sort of have emerged sort of just sort of organically, maybe as outgrowths of existing cities, but there wasn't really a sort of central organizer. It wasn't a deliberate effort in the same way that some of these cities were. Maybe Gurgaon in India kind of comes to mind as an example of a type of city that maybe is a new city, but it wasn't actually planned or organized formally in any sort of way. And then the final inclusion criteria is governance, that there actually is a single distinct governance structure for the city that makes it sort of distinct from other parts, other cities. So we're not just talking about, say, a neighborhood in another city, but we're actually talking about a unique city that has its own administration and is its own standalone political entity. So those are the high level overview of the inclusion criteria on how we got down from over 1,000 new cities worldwide since 1945 to a core set of over 300 that we feel most accurately captures the spirit of this sort of grand project of building new cities.
Well, it's good to hear all the characteristics that the cities needed to have to be included, because as you mentioned, there's various ways in which people can define new cities. And I think this brings it down to exactly what you wanted to accomplish with the map. So with that, so this map was commissioned, financed, and designed by the Charter Cities Institute. And then the Adrianople Group planned, collected the data, and built the software which runs the map. But why was it so important for the Charter Cities Institute to have this map published?
Well, new cities is obviously a very important topic for the work we're doing. And like I said, there are other tools and databases and resources and research that's out there on new cities, but we really just did not feel like what was out there was adequate enough to do the kind of rigorous analysis of new cities that's needed to best inform policymakers and other researchers about this space to ensure that the cities that are getting built are making the best possible decisions that they can about where to locate, what they should have authority over, their sort of economic focuses and industries, target industries ought to be. We really just wanted to help bring some depth and a comprehensive study of new cities to this ecosystem, which really just doesn't exist before. Like I said, a lot of the research and work that's done in this space up till now is very case study, piecemeal, qualitative, and that's all great. But we wanted to bring a new sort of front to this research and to this type, this work that's being done on the ground that just doesn't exist until now.
I agree that this map definitely has a lot of information that other databases had not been included. As you mentioned, they're all very great and they provide very important information. And so in this new cities map, something that is very important that is now available is also those governance variables that provide information on whether the city has responsibility for services, how much decision making they have. So what I want to know is also, how did you decide what was important to be shown in the map regarding those governance variables?
Sure. So we wanted to paint a comprehensive picture of all of the different elements that go into sort of urban governance and thinking about cities. So we didn't want to just say, okay, here's where it is on the map, and here's where how many people live there. But we actually wanted to be able to paint a comprehensive picture of each city that says, okay, in this city, here's what the government is and is not responsible for. Here's what the government does or does not have sort of fiscal authority over. Here's whether or not the city is also a special economic zone. We wanted, does the city, can it set a minimum wage? Can it have special immigration policy? Are there special customs procedures? What type of legal protections exist? How autonomous is this city relative to others, in its own country. We really wanted to paint a comprehensive picture of each city, and not just, like I said, not just catalog points on a map, but provide some really rich data that helps better characterize and helps better explain why a city might be located where it is, or why it has the sort of maybe target population, or has reached the population that it has, what its economic focus is, and help make more sense of all of this data that's sort of out there, but had never really been collected or really thoroughly analyzed before.
So this data itself is going to provide a lot of information and a lot of guidance, I think, to a lot of people who are looking to know more about how the city operates, more than just knowing about, how many people they intended to have, or whether they expected it to be done by a certain date, etc. So how can you envision that map being used, whether it is as a researcher, as an urban planner, or as a policymaker?
So, right, there's obviously an interactive element to the map product itself, which I think just from a visual perspective, you can see, and there's all sorts of ways that you can sort and filter and color entries on the map to better identify the types of cities that you're looking for whatever your purpose happens to be. And then I think, which I think is useful, sort of especially for policymakers, where they're not going to be reading highly detailed journal articles or something like that. They need the quick hits, and so I think a tool like that is particularly valuable in that setting. But then in terms of the more in-depth research, like I mentioned before, a lot of the research in this space is being done, urban studies departments, geography departments. A lot of this is, like I said, qualitative case study, and that's wonderful. But now that we've got a database that has over 70 different variables in it, now we're getting into the territory where you can actually start to do some statistical analysis on new cities writ large. If there's some information that you want to find out about new cities, say specifically in India or something, right? You can now start to actually be able to run that analysis with the data set that we're providing here, which really hasn't been possible before, and unless you went and actually collected all of that data yourself. And even then, that would have been, it took us 2 years to collect all this data. It really hasn't been, until now, it really hasn't been, specifically thinking about new cities, really hasn't been collected in any kind of way like this before, right? You in a lot of places, it's difficult enough to find data in much of the world on existing cities. And so for researchers interested in new cities, the challenge is often is really going to be even harder. And so we've tried to solve that problem for researchers who are interested in new cities, regardless of their discipline.
It's definitely something that has a lot of value for anyone that is researching over the ecosystem. Considering what you mentioned, there's a lack of data, or at least consistent data, that is shown on the internet, for example. So I can think of examples in which most of the data from cities were from secondary sources, from either that is news outlets or interviews or articles, because the city's official, let's say, documents or websites are not available for the public. They tend to be just available for the developers or anyone involved on the project. So I think it adds a lot of value for people to have all this research gathered, and also considering that it's going to be public database as well, where you can also get the sources from the data available, in which cases some of the data does not provide a full description of the city, and having the sources will give the full overview of the different variables that has the map. So I think that's another part that adds a lot of value for this map. And so, as you mentioned, there's over 300 cities on the map, and there's different trends going on. So what are your what did you consider were the most interesting findings or trends of this map?
One of the tools that I think is really interesting to watch when you use the map is the time lapse feature. And so you can see, starting in 1945, where new cities start to get built and where you start to see clusters of new cities getting built. So, for example, starting in the 1970s, you can see right in front of you this huge boom of new cities in Egypt, and starting in some of the Gulf states, for instance. You can watch that play out in real time. And then I think what else is interesting is that once you really get into the last maybe 15 years, you start to see a real takeoff of new city developments in sub-Saharan Africa, which I think is particularly interesting to us at CCI, where that's the vast majority of our actual work is concentrated. So I think that's a particularly valuable and an interesting piece is to be able to see over time where these cities are happening. And like I said, I also think some of the sort of sorting features are really interesting, and you can sort of see the trends where, okay, here's where in some countries you can see, okay, most of these new cities are privately developed, or maybe they're publicly developed by the government, or is it a PPP? And you can see, in some countries it's a mix of both, in others it's maybe all one or all the other. So that's interesting. That's another that's I think is interesting to see. You can also sort of sort by is it greenfield? Is it brownfield? Is it redevelopment of some other type of area? This also helps I think give all these different types of tools help give some clarity to what are the trends going on in a particular country or region. And when we're talking about new cities in that place, what are we actually talking about? Because for some countries, new cities tend to be a certain type of project, whereas in another country they might be very different. So to be able to see that clearly in front of you, I think is helpful just for conceptualizing. How should I go about thinking about new cities? Either in my country of interest or writ large. What are the trends? So I think that's a particularly valuable tool in the New Cities Map Toolkit.
I think what you mentioned is also very insightful in regards of what can I do if, for example, you're trying to build a new city and you're trying to see the different examples or the trends that are happening in each country. And one of the features that could also help in that is the one regarding city focus, in which you'll be able to see whether, the trend is that in a certain country, there's a lot of eco cities, smart cities. In the case of Africa, there's a lot of satellite cities as well. And for example, Mexico as well, a lot of the cities included in the map are resort cities. So that's another way, and the map can be beneficial when trying to figure out what the trends are per country as well. And I think that's also very insightful, as I mentioned, when trying to discover what the context is for each country. And so another thing that was mentioned, and I think it's very interesting and surprising, is that there were over 1,000 cities that were researched. And since you mentioned there's an inclusion criteria which needs to be followed, whether that is, the announcement date being from 1945 to October 2021, from having a population of over 100,000, or planning to have that with the other rest of the criteria that you mentioned. From the beginning, did you have any expectations of how many cities were going to be included in the map? Or was that something surprising to see at the end of the data collection?
It's a little bit of both, because part of the problem with any sort of study or analysis of the new city space is actually trying to define, what are we actually talking about when we're talking about new cities. And so depending on what you're counting as a new city, the estimates of either ones that have been built or are being built now were always kind of all over the place. For example, the International New Towns Institute has a database of, it's not just cities, but also much smaller scale developments as well. And I think there's like over 1,000 entries on their map, because of the fact that they're going down to a little city of 15,000 people or something like that, which really is maybe more of a town than a city, is on that map. So honestly, I really didn't actually going in know exactly what to expect. But I think it is interesting how with this inclusion criteria that we've developed, when you actually really try to concretely define new cities in a sort of specific and purposeful way, you end up with a core group of several hundred, which I think accurately reflects what we know and what we're seeing. Although, of course, in the future, that number is definitely going to grow.
Well, it's good to hear. I think a lot of either the people developing this map were not expecting to have such a solid group of cities, right? From such a great amount of cities being scrutinized and, determining whether they're going to be part of the map or not. But I'm glad to hear that the map has a solid number that is going to be very helpful, that is going to provide very valuable information, other than just, providing various new cities. It has very solid inclusion criteria. So from all this data being collected, whether that is the master plan details or the governance variables, how is this data set going to be helpful for the future of cities? Do you think that this data is also going to help in the ecosystem to become more data driven?
Absolutely. As we've kind of talked about, I think the uses for both researchers as well as policymakers and city developers focused on new cities now is really useful. And I think this will also be helpful for existing cities as well. Right. There's no reason why an existing city couldn't potentially use this data to identify new cities that are similar to themselves and figure out what's been done there and how they could think about that, especially in the context of planning for urban expansion. Like so many of the cities throughout the global south are really being forced to do now. And so I think there's a lot of learning to be had here from all of these new cities, both for other new cities and as well as for sort of the growing existing cities in the world.
It's definitely going to be a data set that provides a lot of value to all researchers or policymakers. I think it has been very complete with its data. And so to discuss the future development plans for the new cities map, can we know more about what's going to happen with, the current regions that are completed on the map and the ones that are still ongoing efforts to complete the project?
Sure. So as I mentioned, to collect all of the data to get to where we are today, it took just shy of 2 years to collect data on all of these cities that were analyzed and for all of the variables included. So for Latin America, North America, and India, the full slate of all variables of interest are available for every city entry. For Africa, which especially for ZCI is one of the most important parts of the world going forward, for thinking about new cities and for urbanization more generally, we have all of the variables except for some of the governance indicators. And then for Europe, the Middle East, and Asia, we have the location and the variables needed to run the inclusion criteria test, but otherwise the completion of those variables is only partial. So going forward, what we want to do is to be able to secure the funding to continue to build out a complete roster of variables for this particular snapshot in time of all cities in all regions. And then beyond that, we'd love to be able to make this a living database into the future that's able to expand with new entries as time progresses.
So as you mentioned, this is a snapshot of all cities until 2021. And so if someone wants to reach out to you to add information to a new city, how can they do that? Where should they be reaching out to?
Sure. So you can reach out to CCI generally at chartercitiesinstitute.org. You can find our contact information there, or you can also contact our my colleague, our quantitative researcher Tommy Thompson at tommy@cci.city. He's been the lead on getting this map built from our end.
Great. Well, I think we've had a very insightful conversation going over the concept of a new city and how data is actually a missing factor in the industry. And overall, I think we also have made it very clear that this map is going to be valuable for anyone who's interested in knowing more about the new cities map and also about the great work that the Charter Cities Institute is doing to provide this information. So
and Adrianople Group
and the Adrianople Group in the development of this. So I'm happy to know that the map is going to be live on May 30 this year, 2023. Do you have any final remarks, Jeffrey, that you want to share with the audience?
Yeah, I hope if you're listening to this on or before May 30 this year, you're able to join us at the launch event, which you can register for at newcitiesmap.com. We'll be having a live demo of the map as well as a discussion on new cities, and we'll be fielding some Q&A. So I hope folks who listen are able to attend.
Great. Well, thank you for coming into the podcast, Jeffrey, and sharing more about your expertise. We'll be happy to have you back on the podcast in the future. And to our listeners, you can find us on iTunes, Audible, or anywhere else you listen to your podcast. So thank you again, Jeffrey, for your time today. And yeah, we'll see you in the next episode.
Thanks for having me, and I hope everyone enjoys the New Cities map.